Okay, let's just dive right in. Today we're going to talk about Daniel. As you can see there, I want to highlight principles, patterns, and priorities out of the life of Daniel. It's nice to actually, nice, it's maybe the wrong word. It's helpful, I think, to consider what Daniel's experience is coming into Babylon. You know, the issues that bring about Daniel and what happens in his life all starts in bloodshed and war and sacking the temple and fire and horror. It's a bad, bad deal that starts off. And so everything that happens is all in the context of captivity, all in the context of being away from everything that we know, away from everything that life has been built around. They're refugees in a very real sense. Explicitly, they're refugees. You see this in this particular psalm. Some rabbis think that actually Jeremiah wrote this. There's an I don't remember if it's Syriac version or what, but it says to David from Jeremiah, a psalm. But anyway, regardless of who wrote it, this lamentation psalm is what we think of when we think of the captivity. Just to point out, you know, I don't think we're as landed generally as the Jews were. Like the notion of home and security and civility and everything that matters is all tied into place for the Jews in these temple eras in ways that it's hard to recapitulate. It's hard to put yourself in that place. But the physical space of the land, I mean, you're all post-Enlightenment, Western civilization, raised Christian people by and large. And so it's hard to assimilate the idea of how important the place was itself. And so when we read this, it kind of rings, you know. If I forget let my right hand forget her cunning. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my eye. It's like water. My remembrance of Israel is like water. And then the dreadful end of this, O daughter of Babylon, who art to be destroyed, happy shall he be that rewardeth thee as thou hast served us. Happy shall he be that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stones. That's pretty heavy stuff. It's a calling of judgment, and the worst kind of judgment, that you'd take children and beat their heads against stones. That's what they're crying out for. So that captivity mindset is, there's a couple interesting things about it. You know, first of all, it comes from trusting in Egypt. There's that whole war. Let's just go back here for just a second. That whole war, you know, it's 4 years basically. What ends up in the siege of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, and for many years, several years before the siege, Jerusalem was paying tribute to Babylon, and then Nebuchadnezzar tries to invade Egypt and fails. And when he fails, a lot of these little Levantine countries kind of do a quasi-rebellion and they quit paying taxes. Well, needless to say, the Babylonians were not happy about that, and they put things in quick order. And that's what leads to the siege of Jerusalem in Daniel's day. The Babylonian Empire coming back and saying, no, you're not going to get away with this. So one of the things that was the consequence of the siege was the removal of the instruments of the temple. And this one actually is a recreation, but that's a person's head. I pulled in the picture, but you can see how big these things were. Like they're carrying them on their shoulders. This isn't from the Babylonians, obviously, but it's a representation of what it looked like when the temple was sacked and these implements were taken out. They weren't small things. They weren't tabletop ornaments. They were huge, huge things. And they were just as huge culturally and religiously to the Jews. They were the thing that made them them. They were the things that distinguished them as God's special chosen people. And all of these things go away in the captivity along with some of these people. And it has to have it contributes to what we read in that psalm, this feeling of loss, this feeling of dread. But I wondered there's a certain way in which we can put ourselves in a captivity, for our present condition. The church right now is in exile. In a certain sense, our little outposts called churches, called emissaries of the kingdom of God, are in places that are not our own. And I want to talk about that more as we go along, but we can condition our thinking a little bit that we're in an occupied territory. We're not so far removed from the idea of exile ourselves. And the concepts of Babylon are durable concepts throughout all the rest of the New Testament into Revelations. When we read about Babylon is fallen, all these images that come back, that harken back to Daniel's day, are things that we're supposed to be immersed in and thinking about ourselves. They're contemporary ideas, albeit they're a little more existential. So what does this mean, these implements? The question I asked myself, so if this is what makes the Jews unique, what makes us unique? What's the potential that we have to identify with this notion of the things, the implements and the instruments of the temple being removed and taken away, being displaced so that the people can't identify with who and what they are? Well, you can let your imagination run there a little bit, but there's quite a few things that I can imagine that are the distinctive elements of who God's people are that the devil would love to steal away, that he would love to take into the house of his gods, that he would love to remove from our identity and from our access. And so these are the things that, we often think of them in terms of the clash of cultures. What's distinctive about Christian people today that's being removed, that's being pulled out, that's being stripped away? Well, there's all kinds of things, our positions about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a husband, what it means to be a wife, what it means to be married, what it means to be a child, how we dress, how we look, how we act, how we think, what we do, these things that are distinctively Christian. Let's talk about that term for a minute, just a second. Distinctively Christian, what does that mean? I think Dean mentioned E. Stanley Jones, and if you haven't read E. Stanley Jones, I would recommend it. He wrote several books. He's a very interesting guy. He had a bit of a mental breakdown, and then he got over that through his faith, and then went to India. And he was a very interesting guy, because what he would do is when he was in India, he had an ashram, a community, and he would get together some Christian men and some Muslim men and some Hindu men, and they would live together for a month at a time. And every day they would sit around a big round table and they would talk about their respective faiths. And if you read E. Stanley Jones, one of the things that you'll recognize that he's particularly astute at is determining what's specific about Christianity. Because almost all religions say don't hurt people and be nice to people and give money to the poor and don't murder, and all these universal morality issues are not distinctives of Christianity. They're in Islam, they're in Hindu, they're in all kinds of religions. Be a good person is kind of like the bottom line of what a religion is. And so there's a lot of things that are in common. But what's not common? What is distinctly Christian? What differentiates the things that we do and we believe from what anybody else does? Can anybody think of anything that's distinctively Christian?
The idea of God as our Father.
God as a father, that's probably pretty rare. It may not be unique, but it's
becoming man.
the incarnation is pretty distinct. A monotheistic trinity would certainly be a distinctly Christian idea. There's other practices that are distinctly Christian, right?
Non-resistance.
Non-resistance is, I don't know of any, well, the Jains might be close. But the Jains use violence. They can use violence. So yeah. That's those things, I think, those things that make us us are the things that the devil would like to take away from us. The things that the empire of the world would like to strip out of who we are. To make us bland, to make us like everybody else, to make us like the nations. Because, it goes back to the Roman Empire as well. The Romans, the Babylonians were like this too. You could worship just about any god in the Roman Empire. And it wasn't the fact that the Christians had a god that wasn't common that made them a problem. What made them a problem is that their God wouldn't share his place. So, if you have a God that will sit in the pantheon, if your God will take a chair at the table of gods, you can fit. Anybody can fit. The Celts can fit, the North Africans can fit, just about any pagan deity can fit at the pantheon. But if your God cleans house and says, I'm the only God, that's the only thing that's not tolerable. And that's what makes the Christians a problem, in part. It's what makes the Christians a problem in the Roman Empire and why the purges happen and the persecutions happen. Those things that made those people different and unassimilable, unique and discrete, were the problem. Our teachings on non-resistance, I think, are particularly under threat. Our teachings on who we are as people, what it means to be a human under the Creator, our typology of marriage being a picture of Christ in the church and all the attendant consequences from that, all those things are at stake, by and large. Okay, so they go into captivity, where you can open your Bible to Daniel chapter 1. All this is just a synopsis of what we read in the first few verses of Daniel chapter 1. But here in the 4th verse it says that in verse 3, and the king spoke to Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, children in whom there was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So, for Daniel and a few fortunate people, the very, very poor and destitute stayed in Israel. They weren't worth bringing. Many people were killed, and some of the best and the brightest became exiles in Babylon. The best and the brightest. We talked about that already with Joseph and with David. This premise of excellence comes out again and again throughout these passages. I'm not going to belabor that point. We talked about it yesterday. But it's interesting of note also that it's the young people they want. Always the young. It's the young people they want. And that's not for no reason, right? We want the young people too. We want to raise up our young people. We want to raise up our children. We want to take the zeal and the passion and the power and the potential of our young people in the kingdom of God and do something with them, prepare them, and and give them the tools that they need to produce these lives of excellence. The building that you're sitting in is designed with that in mind. That's no small part of what's happening here, is the interest in, because I've said it, I think, the third time now, we need people that are excellent. We need writers. We need biblical language scholars. We need theologians. We need artists. We need poets. We need people who are excellent for the purposes of the kingdom of God. None of those things are wasted. None of those things are non-essentials. They're supposed to be developed and honed and made sharp. So he takes all the best and the brightest and he brings them to Babylon. He wants to harvest the best of those people. That's why I mentioned Sattler. We have some of our young people that are very bright, and our homeschools in particular, we raise up these children, we give them incredible skills of learning and aptitude, and then we send them to Harvard or to the local community college or whatever, and it's not a healthy place. It doesn't work well. We're turning our harvest into Babylon. It just goes away, and there it gets spoiled. And that's really what they're trying to do in Babylon. Their intention is to advance the purposes of Babylon with the best and the brightest of Jerusalem. We want your best and your brightest because we want that harvest for ourselves. But here's Daniel's problem. Picking up in verse 5. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. Forbidden meat. I don't know what was about this king's meat that was a problem for Daniel. Maybe it was the wrong kind of meat. Maybe it had been sacrificed to their idols. I don't know, but there's something that he discerns very clearly that this is a no-go for me. And that's the interesting part, right? He says in the next verse, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. So Daniel has this primary principle, this rudimentary self-image of who he is and what he's about. And this food violates that. Now, this is a thorny situation, right? He's in exile. He doesn't have a whole lot of say in this situation to begin with. He's already, what do you think about when you show up in a Babylonian dorm and everybody you know is dead, most of them, and everybody else has been on a long exile journey, and here you are and they finally set food in front of you, and you're one of the fortunate that made it out alive, right? And you're going to turn your nose at that. There's a lot in this situation that would cause you not to make this choice. And whatever it is in Daniel's life that causes him to purpose in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's meat is bigger than all of that. So we have to say it's something that's at the core of who he is. And it doesn't say explicitly, but I'm fairly sure that the recognition of this principle, what makes Daniel make this decision, did not happen when a platter of food was brought to him. That it was something that he already knew, that he already was. So here's what I want to make a point of. Principles are better than rules. Because how do you make a rule for going into captivity in Babylon and becoming one of the people that the king is? You can't figure out a rule for that scenario. And that's actually the problem with rules, is that they're very, very limited in scope. They're practical, minute decisions. But there's almost an infinite number of things that they don't apply to. And this is why principles will always excel over rules. Because if a principle is something that tells you what to do when you don't know what to do, that's a very, very valuable thing. When you can create things in your life that will instruct you what to do when you don't know what to do, that's a life of principle. The rules can never keep up. And I'm not saying that there's, the speed limit's a rule. We should follow it. And even Jesus, when he talks about the Pharisees, he says, do what they say. Keep their rules, but don't do what they do. That's a problem. Here's the thing. Example that I've seen played out. Church I knew, the young people had too much money, and they started going skiing. And they went skiing because there's no rule against skiing. And so there they are on the slopes. And everybody says, what are you doing up there? And they say, we're going skiing. They say, and the older crowd, they say, I'm not sure that's so right. And they say, well, is there a rule against it? Well, no, but maybe there should be. So then the discussion starts. And the discussion starts, and maybe we need to have a rule about skiing. And the discussion drags on, and the discussion drags on. And by the time they say, really, we probably should have a rule against skiing, now they're snowboarding. Well, there's no rule against snowboarding. And, well, I wonder if that applies too. And I wonder if we should have a rule against snowboarding. And the meetings drag on, and the meetings drag on. And finally there's a meeting, and there's a rule about no more snowboarding. But now we don't care about snowboarding. Now we're snowmobiling. And after that we're water skiing. And after that we're parasailing. And after that we're paragliding. And after that it can't ever keep up. It's a losing game. It either has to be so cumbersomely restrictive that it covers all of life and there's no life that's allowed out, or it's always behind the curve. And I don't see that in Daniel's life. I see something in him that knows how to tell what would be within and without the parameters of what was right for him to do. That's not externally imposed, it's internally imposed. He purposed in his heart not to defile himself with the king's meat and wine. It doesn't come from outside. Because see, here's the thing, Daniel's all alone. Here he is in the big wide world, and nobody's looking. Nobody's there to tell him. Mom and dad are gone and probably dead, or maybe in some other penal colony somewhere else in Babylon. But they're not there. Nobody's looking over his shoulder saying, hey, Daniel, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to do that. It's not there. And here's the problem that's very real for us today. Nobody's there with you either. Now, I don't care if you live in your parents' house or not. You know as well as I do. Look, when I first started in the kingdom, I went out and took my TV and I shot it with a shotgun. This thing has more power than I could have ever gotten on my television. There is more potential for wickedness than this, and it's in my pocket with me everywhere I go, every day. So nobody's over my shoulder. The rule isn't going to fix my control of this device. Well, you can not have these, you can throw them out the window and say we're not going to use them, but it's just kicking the can down the road. The world you and I live in, if you don't have something inside of you that you purpose in your heart not to defile yourself with the king's phone, with the king's internet, with the king's computer, with the king's entertainment, with the king's whatever, nothing else is going to help you. Not in any long-term sense. The principles that Daniel had in his life allowed him to know what to do when this showed up on a plate. He said, no, I'm not going to do it. And you can tell he's resolved, right? This isn't a momentary thing. He purposes in his heart. It's something deep inside of him. It's an internal commitment. Job says there in Job 31, remember, he says, I made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? Same kind of deal. A contract with self. An identification that's for me, by me, and about me. I'm going to do this. This is what I am going to live for, and what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to do. That's the value of principles. Michael mentioned the other day before the prayer groups, he talked about mission statements, right? You remember that? I wasn't there, I was told. But what he was talking about there is the things that flow out of your core principles. What's derived from what you're about? What's at the core of what you want to be about, and how is that working itself out? So, what are your core principles? What are the things that that instruct you when you don't know what to do? I'm pretty sure that you'll have a lot of experiences in your life where you won't know what to do. I'm pretty sure you probably already have. So how do you navigate that? How do you navigate that place? You see, here's the point I want to make. If you are trying to figure that out on the fly, you're no better than some committee in a church trying to figure out a rule. It's far too slow. It's way behind the curve, and you end up doing all kinds of things. And then after the fact, after you're a mile down that road, you think, well, was this what I wanted to do? Is this where I wanted to be? Am I sure that I want to do this? And it's just quite often the case that the train's already left the station. And it's hard to roll it back. But if you have some kind of expression, some kind of knowledge about yourself and what your principles are, what the first things that are important to you and what the second things that are important to you, if you have some kind of sensibility, and not vague, not I want to be a good Christian, not I want to obey Jesus, but really explicit, like here's what I will and won't do. Here's the things that are core principles in my life that I want to shape my life around. One of the core principles of my life has been that when my wife and I were converted, very early on, we said to ourselves this. We had explicit conversations about this. We said, there's all kinds. We started seeing things in the Bible that we'd never really encountered. Well, she's reading the Bible for the first time. She didn't experience the Bible, but I did. But there were all kinds of things that we were considering that I didn't know what to make of. I came home from work one day and Erica said, hey, look at this. And she opens up 1 Corinthians 7 and she reads it and she says, doesn't it seem like I should be wearing a head covering when I pray? And I was like, I don't know about that. I've never heard anybody do that before. I've never seen anybody do that before. But it does kind of look like that. I'm not sure. I don't know what to do. And so we thought about it, and we talked about it, and we prayed about it. And what we decided at the end of that talking and praying and thinking was that if we could conclude that God wanted us to do something, If we could conclude that something was from God, we would not worry about why it was, that we would just do it. And that one principle has served my life time and time and time and time again. All I have to know, since my youth, all I have to know is that God said to do it. That's it. I don't worry about why. I don't worry about what the consequences are. I don't worry about the conclusions. I don't worry about what other people will think about it. I don't worry about any of those things. I just have to know that God said to do it, and I'll do it. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. That's a kind of first principle. And you should have a set of those in your life. And they should be explicit. If they're not explicit, they won't serve you well. All right, so he's purposed in his heart. And then the next thing that happens. So he goes to the head eunuch and he says, "Hey, we don't want to eat this stuff. Give us, we'll be vegetarians." And the guy's worried, and we all know what happens, right? They end up better off. Let's talk a little bit about miracles for a minute. So I have a theory, and you can test it with me. I have a theory that there's something like a divine economy. And what I mean by that is that God doesn't waste his resources. He's not wasteful. And so generally, anything that we're supposed to do, we're supposed to do. That the things that we generally call miracles are things that lie outside of the realm of what we're naturally supposed to do. So when we've done everything that we can and should and could do, and there's still something that needs to be done for God's glory, that's when miracles happen. So let's look at this case. So Daniel purposes in his heart. That's what he's supposed to do. He makes a choice. He makes a decision, and he walks it out. Hey, we're not going to do this. It's a right or wrong thing. I have to take whatever consequences come from that, and I'm going to the authority and I'm telling him what's going on. I'm asking in humility. He's doing everything he's supposed to do. What's left? Well, he can't make himself grow. I don't know how strenuous their life was, but eating salad isn't going to build muscle. At least not very well. And everybody else has this rich, fat diet. Now, this isn't an American institution. This is an old world Babylonian institution where meat's precious. We go overseas in the developing world, and meat is not a common commodity. These guys are lucky to have meat. Meat's a treat. All those calories, all that protein in one meal, that's a rare thing. And here they are snubbing their nose at it. Now, it is not likely, not only is it not likely, it's not possible that these guys that are eating healthy whole meals are less strong than the guys that are eating salad. But there it is. And that's the function of miracles. And here's another thing about that, is that grace is a kind of miracle. Okay? Grace, I don't want to get too distracted on it. Grace is God's power. It's not unmerited favor. If you've been told that, you've been told wrong. Grace is not unmerited favor. It's a pet peeve of mine. Unmerited favor is mercy. Mercy and grace are not the same thing. God is definitely merciful, no doubt about it. But his mercy and his grace are not the same thing. Grace is God's power. Specifically, it's God's power to do his will. But it's miraculous. It doesn't have its origin in us. It's something that we have access to through Christ, through our baptism, through the Holy Spirit, through the church. There's a lot of means for grace, but it's God's power. It's not ours. But you only have access to that after you've followed the economy, after you've done what you're supposed to do. You walk up to the door, and then when you've reached the end, that's where grace is. That's where miracles are. That's where the stuff that only God does is. So what that means is that you don't get to see that until you've gone to the end of your road. You don't get access to that. You don't get access to the special things that only God does until you've limited yourself, until you've done everything you're supposed to do, until you've walked it out as far as you can go, until you've reached the end of your limit, until you can't do what needs to be done. You don't get access to this stuff. And that's why we see it in these stories. That's why the Bible is what it is, because it's the stories of people who go as far as they can, and it's not far enough, and that's where God meets them and sees them the rest of the way. And this story in Daniel is a perfect example of that. He purposes in his heart, he makes the decision, he walks it out, and then God provides results that he couldn't have made. That's how those things work. It occurs to me also that in regards to that same kind of divine economy, the things that you have access to, okay, let's stop for a second. Jesus' disciples come to him and they say, hey, we got a problem here. There's this child that has a devil and we can't cast it out. We've been casting devils out all over the place. This one's not working. And what does he say? He calls them a faithless generation. And he says, such cometh not out but by what? Prayer and fasting. And then he immediately proceeds to do what? Cast out the devil. Where was the prayer and fasting? It's already done. He'd already done his part. He was already prayed up. He was already fasted up. He was already ready. So that when the moment came, when the need was there, your prayer life shouldn't be an emergency plan. Your prayer life shouldn't be a fire alarm. It's not, oh no, things are so bad, I better pray. Your prayer life is supposed to be something that you use day in and day out. That you, before you're in the crisis, before you have the problem, you're there with God saying, hey, how do I get ready? What's missing here? My prayer life is me trying to figure out what I'm supposed to be, where I should be, what I should be doing, what's out of order. That the constant and regular use of that interaction with God, that sitting on the end of your bed and saying, how do I set this right? What am I supposed to do here? What's in me that's out of order? That's the stuff that gets you ready for these moments. That's what builds a life. And far too many, even of our own people, use their desperate prayer life not for really doing the long, hard work, but for the fire plan, for the things aren't going right, for the what do I do now. And I'm not saying, hey, when there's problems, go to God. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, but if you haven't gone to God before then, you're probably not going to find what you're looking for. At least it's going to be really rough, rocky road. But there's a way that you can prepare yourself for anything in the future. There's a way where you can build up your inner man, where you can become strong and disciplined and righteous without having to be in crisis. In fact, all those muscles need to be built when you're not in crisis. There's a lot of miracles in this whole book. And they all follow this same pattern. I would submit that probably every miracle in the Bible follows this pattern. There might be some minor exceptions to that. Can I think of one? The cock crowing thrice is a little bit of an extravagance. But it's to illustrate that God knows what's happening in Peter's life. Anyhow, you can think about that with me. But this is the common pattern for miracle anyhow. I wanted to talk about, so they don't eat the meat. They have this all show up. Let's read to the end here. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill and all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. That's just something that God fills into his life right here. Now, at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them. And among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. So it worked, right? It had a practical result. But what I want to highlight here is that these guys are faithful without a temple. Okay? Their whole institutional structure has been ripped out from underneath them. I used to always wonder this when I was a little boy and I'd read the Bible. I was like, what do you do in Babylon without a temple? When you can't make your sacrifice, when there's no Day of Atonement, when there's no feast, when there's no continual sacrifice at the temple daily. What does it mean to be a Jew without a temple? Well, why does that matter to me? Well, what it matters to me is that it's fairly common that we're not in an ideal scenario. That things aren't quite all as they should be. Maybe the church isn't working right. Maybe it's got all kinds of problems. Maybe I'm at the third church in as many years because of said problems. Maybe I don't think things are as they should be. Maybe my family life is a little out of order. Maybe my parents have problems. Maybe my siblings have problems. Maybe I have problems. Maybe a bunch of things. So how do you be a faithful Jew without a proper temple? What does that mean, even? What does that mean to be faithful outside of the ideal? What if my relationships, the things that I depend on, or should depend on, are being pulled apart? How am I supposed to conduct myself when I have a bunch of notions for the way things should be, and those aren't being borne out? Well, Daniel and his friends figure out a way through that mess. Their temple is gone, their sacrifices have ceased, and they're in a strange land. They're completely alone. But something else ties them. Something else, it's those same principles that we were talking about. Those principles tie them to their identity, tie them to what they're supposed to be. That functions in Daniel's life. His principles and his connection to the God of the temple connects him the same way that the sacrifices were, the same way that the institution was. That he has this internal strength and internal resolve and internal obligations and connections that are all helped by that external structure. The edifice of the temple, and all of its grandeur, these big stone walls and these altars and lavers and these priestly garments and the sacrifices and the blood and seeing the animals, these things, they're not for God. Can I say that? When those animals are killed in the temple, that's not for God. And I know that because he said it. He said, what, am I hungry that you should feed me? Am I thirsty that you should provide me drink? I don't need this blood. This isn't for me. It's for you. It's to teach you and instruct you and show you. It's to teach you things about me. Well, Daniel learned it. He had internalized it. He understood. The same way, David, it's fascinating to me. David goes and he eats the shewbread. And that's one thing. Like, that's it's history, right? You could say it's good or it's bad. But Jesus highlights David's ability to eat the shewbread. He says, he validates that action. Because David understood what really mattered. David understood what was most important. And that ability to see all of that edifice, all of those important structures, and understand what was really at the bottom of it. What's the point? What is God trying to do with all of this? That's what these holy men, these exemplary men could do. They could see all of that and reduce it to what God's actually trying to show them. And the extent to which you own your principles, the extent to which you really internalize what God wants to do with you in the kingdom of God, is the extent to which the edifice becomes less important. That you can increase your tolerance of being out of the institution. And I don't mean out of the church. I mean that you can be in Babylon. Things cannot be right. Things can be out of order. People can be doing the wrong things around you. Your relationships, the people that you should be able to trust in who aren't trustworthy, won't destabilize you. The more you've internalized who God is and what he's doing with you, the higher your threshold becomes for a messy captivity. For instance, you say, well, what? What's a for instance? You say, well, my church isn't very evangelical. What are we doing? How come we're not X? Why are we not doing this that I think we should do? It's not right. Here's where the Bible teaches us we should be making disciples. We even talked about that yesterday, I think. We should be doing these things. This isn't working right. Here's what we have to do. I know this is right. What do you do with that? What you do with that is the extent to which you've really internalized that principle is the extent to which you do it. That you do it. So here I am, I sit in my church, I go there Sunday by Sunday, and I think, where are all the disciples? How come we're not making disciples? How come nobody's out there bringing people in? How come nobody's whatever? Okay, that's observation. If that is really internalized in me, then I go out and do. And the extent to which I've internalized that, it increases my threshold to not have to make more mess than I fix. To not have to use that observation as a weapon against other people. Here's what often happens. The things that we know that are wrong with people, we use for our own self-interest. That's a really crummy thing to do. You hate it when people do that to you. I guarantee. Because it's not redemptive. There's no love in that. It's taking someone's faults and beating them with it for your own whatever, for your own desire, for your own, to elevate yourself, to get back at somebody, there's all kinds of reasons people do that. But people that have internalized these principles of God, their first principles, they don't do that. First of all, they they are their own most severe critics. That propensity to diagnose, that propensity to see wrong, it turns inward. It doesn't become these conversations about what are we not doing, it becomes a conversation about what should I do. And until that's full, until I feel like I have some mastery and some utility and something to contribute, then it turns into a conversation of what could we do. Here's my piece I can offer. Here's what I can bring to the table. Here's how I can see a way forward. And here's what I'm willing to do to set it right. That's a very different conversation than what's wrong with you all and why don't you X. That's how you be faithful without a temple. You take responsibility for yourself and you try the fruit in your own life. And the first question is always, what about me? What am I doing? Where am I out of order? How am I producing fruit to righteousness and holiness to God? To be exercised in those ways and to go through that self-criticism and that self-analysis and that renewal of what's broken in me and to make fruit out of my life, to make fruit out of my mistakes, to set myself in order, that's what allows me to really have something to contribute. I've seen this a lot in my life because I've always I've always been moving in places that are pushing the edges. And the crowd of people that's in that place are often very critical people. And they're critical people that very often don't have the self-mastery, it's so easy. There's this very, very common default in the way that we think that I say, this thing is wrong, and sometimes that's discovered in me. Sometimes I see it. I'm not doing X. And then I look around and I see, well, nobody else is doing X. And so I say, why aren't you all doing X? Because I'm expecting you to lead me. I'm expecting you to show me. I'm expecting to have an example of what I'm supposed to be doing here. I'm the young one, right? I'm the one that should be coming to the temple and seeing how this is all supposed to work. And I talk to young people all the time that are in bad church situations. I hope I'm not making any assumptions. I don't know any of your churches. I hope you're all in great churches with fantastic examples. But if you're not, even if you are, let me say it this way, even if you are in a great church, the temptation to be skeptical of the people around you who are trying to follow God is very high. Whenever something pushes against your grain, you'll be tempted to have a critical heart and a critical attitude to the people around you. It'll happen in your family, it'll happen in your church situation, it'll happen in your community, it'll happen anywhere. Because we're critical creatures. And God wants to take that criticism. It's a highly developed skill. We are very good at seeing what's wrong. We're very good at it. I don't know anybody well who isn't good at telling what's wrong with people. It's like a superhuman trait that we all possess. I can tell everything that's wrong with everybody else. But what's incredibly rare is the ability to turn that inside. I know very, very few people who are more critical of themselves than others, who turn that laser focus at the mirror. That's not a common trait. But if you want to, I would say if things aren't all as they should be, if you're not experiencing the glories of the temple in your life, if you're not awed and overawed by how well the kingdom of God is shaping itself up in your life, I would encourage you to look in that mirror and to set yourself in order and figure out how you can contribute something to those issues, not just exploit them. How you can start picking up some stones and putting things in order. You know, one of the marvelous things about the temple is that Solomon's temple was built twice, right? What do I mean by that? Every stone that they took out of the quarry, they fit stone to stone. And then they took each stone and they put it up on the Temple Mount so that they would never swing a hammer on the Temple Mount. Now what is that about? Well, it's a statement of the holiness of the temple, first of all, that it's not the place to be beating around on stuff. But that's the care and the precision with which the temple of God was built. And know ye not that ye are lively stones, built up to a holy habitation. And I look back in the Old Testament and I see this care and concern and passion to be precise with God's temple, to take care, and to have enough of a mind for God and His holiness, not to go banging around with hammers and mallets and chisels on the Temple Mount. And then I walk around in the world and I see people dealing with God's temple, and they just are brutal and careless. And not only are they beating around with hammers and chisels in the temple of God, but they're breaking stones in places where they shouldn't be broken. And the way to remedy that is to fashion your own stone. When you're ready and when you're fit, then put yourself in place and show the way. It's a really curative attitude. It sets a lot of things in order. And it makes the rebuilding of the temple much more likely. It makes it that much closer to fulfillment. I spoke with somebody yesterday afternoon about some of these ideas about the church, and we were talking about idealism. Because I've really promoted idealism here, I hope. I want you to be idealists. I want you to practice idealism. But the thing about the temple is, from our context, the neo-temple, the temple of Jesus, the temple of the church, is that you have to be ideal about it. Another one of my pet peeves is this no such thing as a perfect church thing, because the problem is there's only one church that Jesus is coming back for. And that church that He's coming back for has no spot or wrinkle or any such thing. Now, I don't know how much time there is between now and then. I don't know what events are between now and then. But I know that by the time He comes, He's coming for a pure bride. And it's His intention to build a pure bride. And I think some people can take the mentality that it's their job to set the body in order, and that's how we get this banging and beating around in the temple. But if you just say, what's my part? Where do I belong in that? How am I fit? If you see yourself as a stone and you got all these jagged edges hanging out the end, then there's no way that that stone next to you can fit like it's supposed to. Those things have to be hewn down. That's all that interpersonal conflict you feel around God's people. People you don't mesh with, people you don't get along with, people that irk you and annoy you. And you have problems with. Those are those edges. Well, you can't fix the next stone's edges, but you can make yours as smooth as possible. And that's the job. If everybody would do that, then we would be so much closer to a pure temple. We'd be so much further on our way to having things put back in place. So I want to encourage you to be faithful without a temple, like Daniel and his buddies. Dreams. Perceiving patterns. Dreams are weird things. You go crazy if you don't have dreams. Literally. Even animals will go crazy without dreams. I heard somebody talking about the other day, you can take a rat and you can put it on a little pedestal, just barely big enough for it to fit on, and then fill water in the cage. And anytime it starts to go to sleep, its head will dip in water and it can't sleep. And they go crazy. If you ever want to drive a rat crazy, that's how you can do it. I'm not suggesting it. Sounds barbaric. But they've done it. So what is it about dreams? Well, I don't know. I'm way out of my league here. But they're an important part of this book, and they're an important part of Daniel's ministry, really. It's one of the things that it says there in the beginning that God infuses into Daniel is this good favor and this ability to interpret dreams. And I'm not an interpreter of dreams. I've had maybe one dream that I thought was spiritually significant in my life. And I've never interpreted dreams. I actually don't even remember most of my dreams. It's very rare that I remember a dream. But there's something about dreams, right? Dreams are patterns. Whatever they are, they're the part of your brain that you're not in touch with, the back door part speaking to the front door part. It's the back of the house speaking to the front of the house. And what it is about him, and why I think Daniel is so full of dreams, is that they're all about patterns. They're about picking up patterns. Patterns of behavior, patterns of structures, patterns. They say that patterns are, they're an essential part of your brain, the way it works. Animals and people, but especially people. And patterns get entrenched very deeply in your mind. If I were to say A, B, C, you can hear it in your head even without saying it. That's a pattern. From the time you were little, you heard that, and it's stuck there. And now if you're like me, if you're trying to think what letter comes after S, you have to say TUV. Because the pattern, I didn't memorize, we don't really do well with 26 discrete things, but a pattern of 26 things we can do. But then it encodes itself in our minds as one thing with 26 parts instead of discrete elements. That's the value of patterns. It groups things together and it puts them in a place where they're usable. Now you can file that away and the alphabet is one thing instead of all these other little things that have to be. It's a matter of efficiency in your mind. Well, I think that dreams are that. They're these patterns that are deep in your mind trying to manifest themselves. And I don't know to what end. Really, I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows. But what Daniel does with these dreams that come up is he puts these patterns in order. And like I said, I don't have any aspirations to be an interpreter of dreams, but I do want to understand patterns because those are really useful. They're really useful in life. And the best way to start is the same way, the last point that we're talking about. Look at the patterns in your own life. You know, people that have, they struggle with some ongoing issue. Very often there's a cycle in those. There's a pattern of behavior. So I do this, and then this happens, and then this happens, and this happens, and then I have this problem. I do this, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then I have this problem. And there's a pattern behind that behavior. And if you can learn to hack the pattern, if you can learn to perceive it and see it for what it is, well, if you stop the process, you stop the end. You put together the pattern. Every time I go out, I see this, and then I think this, and then this happens. Well, what can you manipulate? What in the pattern can be disrupted? What can you change? How can you change the pattern? Here's the reverse, you know. I notice that every time X happens, I have this temptation and I fall here. Well, now, when X happens, I'm going to do Y. I'm going to have a group of memory verses that I memorize. Every time summer comes around, I find myself struggling with lust. Okay, well, next time, over this winter, I'm going to memorize these 10 scriptures. When summer comes around, that's going to be my go-to. I'm going to change my pattern of behavior. And that's going to set up a new pattern. And the new pattern will be, when something catches my eye, I'm going to recite this, I'm going to take that thought captive, and I'm going to go a different way. And you can establish a new pattern of behavior. And new patterns of behavior can become habits. Patterns of behavior always become habits. Sometimes they're bad habits, sometimes they're good habits. And the same thing that tears people down can be utilized to build people up. Every time I talk with this one person, I feel bad about myself. Every time I talk with this person, I don't like what they say and I get upset. Okay, well, next time I'm going to do this. Next time I talk to that person, I'm going to think about something that they've done recently that was a real blessing, and I'm going to bless them for it. All of a sudden, after a few repetitions of that new pattern of behavior, I find I don't really dislike this person near so much. Patterns are important things. There's patterns in churches. There's patterns in communities. There's patterns in behavior. I was a part of a group of churches that was suffering from a lot of church splits. It wasn't a church, it was a whole group of churches. And they were all nestled into one area, and what would happen is that there would be a problem. There would be a problem in this church, and everybody would go here. And then a year or two would go by, and there'd be a problem in this church, and everybody would go here. And 6 months would go by, and there'd be a problem in this church, and everybody would go here. So one of these situations happened. You could probably predict one of two counties that these churches were probably in. One time this happened, and I had moved away. And so I had gone to this church, and everybody had scattered to the four winds, to the four churches. And I had friends all over the place. And so I began visiting with my old friends in the four churches, and I would say, how are things? How are things going since you left Church X? And they would say, oh, it's great. It's really good. The brethren have really learned, and we're trying to, I don't remember what the mantra was at that point. We're trying to be a brotherhood, or be open, or I don't know what, some kind of cliche. And I would say, oh, I'm glad to hear that. But what happened? And what are you guys doing different so that it won't happen again? And I would get the funniest looks. And they would say, I'm not sure. And I'd go to another brother in one of the 4 churches, and I'd say, same conversation. And I'd say, well, what happened? And what are you doing different so that it won't happen again? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. And I thought, is it just because I'm an outsider? Is it just because I didn't go through that? But why would you go through that time and again and not learn the pattern? Not figure out? And why would you not even ask, what happened and what are we going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again? What's the pattern? Why is this happening? What can be different? If it's a pattern, the fact that I got some chuckles makes me think that this is a pattern that people have seen before. If it's a pattern, why is it happening? And what can we do to make sure it doesn't happen? This had happened another time in my life, and I had left a church. In where this was, there weren't near so many churches. It was just a few people. And I was at a church, and I left, and a bunch of people left, and we all started hanging out together. And we were doing everything but having church together. We were spending all of our time together, and we were starting to do some ministries together. We did everything but church, because I had just left there and I didn't want to do church again. I wasn't sure that I was ready to try to do something like that again. And these guys and we were all sitting here wondering what we were and what we were going to do. And we had a meeting and we said, what are we going to do? And I said, I'm not sure, but I'm a little gun shy. And so I began to pray about it, and I began to wonder, well, what could we do? And what I determined, not by my own wisdom, I feel like God really gave me some insight here. I said, if I do this, then I'm pretty sure that things are going to be really rad for a while, and then something's going to happen, and a bunch of people are going to leave, and I'm going to be here. There's a pattern at play here, and I don't want to do that. So what do I do? So I said, here's what I'll do. I don't think that I can keep this from happening until I figure out why this happened. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back here. I'm going to go back to the place where I don't feel welcome, where I have problems with people, and where things didn't work well. Mainly because I don't feel like I can move forward until I figure out what happened behind me. And this was one of the best decisions I ever made in my life. I learned so much from this one decision, and my main interest was to figure out what's the pattern. Why is this happening? And why am I fairly sure it would happen again? But I don't understand it, and I don't know how to stop it. That's the power of patterns. That's why we have to be observant to these things and thoughtful about them and figure out, whether it's in your life or your community or wherever you're at or your family, where things don't work, what's the pattern behind why they don't work? And Daniel's doing this with God's Spirit, like, to the nth degree. He's decoding the pattern in empire, the pattern in world history, the pattern in the highest echelons of the mixture between the kingdoms of this world and the kingdoms of darkness. He's seeing, perceiving, and elaborating on the patterns. Well, if Daniel can do that, I think we can figure out our own behavior. why you do the things you do, why our churches do the things that they do. Here's another version. I have one tattoo on my body. It's an anti-police slogan. I have a long checkered history with authority. I come from a place where police are not our friends. And what that did in me is created a pattern. And I left that life a long time ago. It was for good reason that I didn't like police. I was a criminal. But when I quit being a criminal, I still had a pattern. There was still something that I thought I went through. And this happened, I was a Christian. I won't tell you how recently. A policeman drove by. And I thought, ugh, cops. Because that's what I always think, ugh, cops. And as soon as that went by, I thought, I don't know that guy. I don't know anything about him. I don't know why he is what he is. The only reason I have that reaction is because I told myself a story about myself. And I replay that story every time I see that emblem. So I have a story in my head about who I am. But it's really only that. All it is a story. It's a narrative. And it occurred to me, if I just start telling myself a different story, I don't have to be that. I don't have to feel that way. And why would I want to feel that way? There's nothing valuable in it. There's nothing redemptive in it. There's certainly nothing holy in it. But there it is, stuck in my head. All I have to do is start telling myself a different story about myself. Change the pattern. Change the pattern, change the result. So what patterns do you have? Where do you have some pattern that needs modification or rewriting? Speaking of patterns, look here at the end of Daniel. This is this whole vision with the patterns of empire. And then he says, okay, so here's this big statue in the dream, and then in verse 46, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. The king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and the chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Then Daniel requested the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gate of the king. And then Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold. Pattern. He has this dream about this statue that gets crushed. Like, it's all about pride and the arrogance and the hubris of man being crushed by God. And the very next sentence of the next chapter, he makes a gold image. Nebuchadnezzar can't learn from his patterns. This is all this that happens here then with the fiery furnace. I don't know where Daniel is. That's kind of weird. He's curiously absent from this. I don't know why, but this one's all about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But it's the same pattern. Where these guys start is where they go all the way through. And it's the same thing we talked about with Joseph, right? The ability to ascend and descend and to not allow those circumstances to control behavior, that the circumstances are incidental. Whether we are high or whether we are low, whether we're rulers of all the land or whether we're being thrown into the furnace, whether we're in the prison or we're in the castle. No matter where we are, we're the same people. And that kind of consistency is really, really difficult to attain to. That kind of consistency with who you are and how you behave. To be independent of circumstances is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And what I think a part of what provides for consistency, a part of what makes consistency, is the ability to properly prioritize. Now that sounds fairly easy, right? Like you could run through a quick series of priorities in your life, like God is first, and then family, and then church, and whatever else, then your job. You could put together a quick list of your priorities in fairly short order. But it's not as easy as it would appear. Because life is difficult to discern. So right now, these several days of Bible school, I'm spending about 4 to 6, 7 hours putting these together and then speaking to you guys for a couple hours. Well, while I'm doing that, there's a lot of priorities in my life that are not being done. My business isn't going on. I'm not seeing my family like I normally do. Like, there's an alteration of priorities. Well, is that a valid decision to make? Should those priorities be altered? How does this fit in with that? And that fitting this in with that is where the rub of priorities lives. And it's where there's a lot of potential for expediency. It's a lot of potential for compromise, a lot of potential for following easy paths instead of difficult ones. It's a lot of room for the world and its circumstances to insert themselves into your priority structure. And to really keep those priorities in place is the key to creating a consistent life ethic, a consistent way of living. That these things are always in this order, and I keep them in that order. In the narrative, where we see the bigger the priorities are, the more inflexible they should be, right? But there's a lot to mess with their priorities. They're not in Israel. There's no temple. There's no people. They're the only ones. It'd be super easy to keep their position and their place and their wealth. And what about my family? And who's going to take care of Aunt Joe? And what's going to happen with my everything if I don't just, who's going to know? I'm not. Here's an example. People died over not baptizing their children in the Anabaptist revivals. Now, I've done some experiments, thought experiments, and I've asked people in Anabaptist churches, if the world changed tomorrow, and all of a sudden the state said you had to baptize your children or we're going to burn you at the stake, do you think you'd make the same decision? How easy would it be to say, what's the matter? How is it different than giving a state-sanctioned bath to my child? I give my child a bath every week. What's different about this? I don't believe in it. There's nothing to it. There's nothing in that statue. It's not a god. It's just a piece of metal. I could bow down. I'm not. What is that to me? Why am I going to lose my head over that, over a chunk of metal. I can invent a million justifications for why they should have bowed down. And I'm not even in the situation. So what keeps them on their feet? There's some priority structure that they have in their life that all those things are way down the list. That the ease of going along, the ease of fitting in, the ease of doing the wrong thing, the ease of bowing down doesn't mesh with what they're doing. It doesn't fit. It gets in the way of something way more important to them. They have a sense, and this might be what's at the core of it. You see it all over these patriarchal stories and the history of God's people, is that this notion of the honor of God is something that compels people to act in certain ways. Because God, because I'm His, because His name is connected to who I am. And the passion with which these Hebrews hold on to the honor of God is astounding. Now, there's a lot of examples to the contrary. There's a lot of people who are making cakes to the Queen of Heaven in the temple courtyard. But our heroes, they have this amazing capacity to latch on to their identification as God's people. And if I mess up, I'm messing up God's name, and He's so much more important than me. Look at how they say it here. They tell him they're not bowing down. And then verse 19, then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against, his face growls at him. Against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, therefore he spoke and commanded that they should heat the furnace 17 times. I don't know why it says it that way. 17 times more than it was wont to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fire furnace. No, it's just above that. In verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said unto them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Talk about somebody that can't see patterns. This guy's worshipped their God, I don't know how many times now. Now, if you be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, blah, blah, blah. But if you worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a fiery furnace. And who is that God that should deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said unto the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. Now that's a little extra piece. They could have just said no. But they had to be a little flippant about it too. Add a little bit on there. Make sure you understand how clear a case this is. This isn't even a temptation. We're not even a little bit thinking about it. I want you to be very, very clear. We're not even this isn't a hard thing for us to say. It's already decided. Talk about priorities. O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship thy golden image which thou hast set up. There's something about their identification. And so we talk about, I talk about from time to time the importance of names and what we call things. It really does matter. Since I'm airing my pet peeves today, don't say go to church. I know that sounds trivial to some people. Don't say it. The church isn't a place. The church is a people. You can't go to church. Church is a people. The ecclesia. Replace it with the called out ones. We're going to go to the called out ones at 7 o'clock on Wednesday night. That doesn't work. And you violate the notion of what the church really is when you use that terminology. It will mess with your head. You will begin to replace the idea of the church with the place that the church meets. And it's amazing how much of a difference it really makes. Don't say we're going to church. Say we're going to meet with the church. Pet peeve. Because what we say matters. We will shape our ideas around the words that come out of our mouth. And the more you say, go to church at 10 a.m. on Sunday at this place, the more you're getting out of line with what we all know the church really is. The church is a people. It's not a place. And the same thing is true about these broader identity issues. When somebody asks me, what are you? I say, I'm a Christian. And it's with very much intention that I say, I am a Christian. Because there's something at stake in that conversation. Here's what happens. If I'm in Costco with my family, people say, oh, look at the cute little girls in their dresses, and that's so nice, and aren't you cute, and all that stuff. And they come up to me and they say, oh, what are you? And they want to hear Amish or Mennonite or something like that. And I say, I'm a Christian. And all of a sudden they get a funny look on their face. Why do they get a funny look on their face? They get a funny look on their face because they probably consider themselves a Christian. And now there's a conflict over the identity. Who's the Christian here? Are they the Christian or am I the Christian? And they have this quick-firing thoughts run through their head. Well, I'm a Christian, and I don't do all those things, so why are they saying they're a Christian? They must not be a Christian. And it makes people upset sometimes. No, but what kind of Christian? Just a Christian. No, but are you Mennonite? No, I'm just a Christian. And here's what that means to me. What it means is that we are the people of Jesus who follow his teachings. That's a different conversation. And when I only own that title, when I only make that claim, it becomes a contention. We have to decide. You have to decide in your mind, what does that word mean? Because there's two competing claims about it. And that's a valuable conflict. That actually has value in people's lives. And that's what promotes some kind of healthy conversations out of the things that just come up randomly, just by being us in the world. And those are really, really great opportunities to have. So all of that connects to who I am. That I am essentially something that has come from Christ. And that's the way that they've created, these three men, these three Hebrews have created their identity structure around who they are in relation to Jehovah, in relation to the God of their people, the God of their fathers, and the God of their land. And that's why they can't do this. Not because there's not a million good reasons to do it, but because the one reason not to do it is more important than all of those other reasons. And that's not about them. It's about him. That's why their priorities matter. So in your own life, I'd encourage you to keep those priorities straight. Who you essentially are is connected to who Jesus has made you to be. That's the honor you have to stake in your life. And corporately, in our churches, that's what our communities are about. That's why we should. Dean mentioned it the other day, and I think it's one of the most profound things that I've ever heard any of our preachers say. John D. Martin says, the church should be what the world would be like if everyone obeyed Jesus. That's a lot that God is staking on us. And it's worth thinking about that. In my attitudes and in my relationships within the church, how is this being a representative of what God wants the world to be like? The way that I love my brothers and my sisters, how is that reflecting accurately the utopia that the world would be if everyone was doing what Jesus said? That's the opportunity, the privilege, and the responsibility that you have as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ. Opportunity because who doesn't want to live in that world? Responsibility because it's how the world is going to know what the gospel means. That has to be the subtext for how we act as a people together. I sit in a meeting. I don't agree with this brother. I do agree with this brother. I have a problem with this brother. Whatever that case is, I don't care what it is. Whatever's happening in the midst of us, the way we deal with it, our love, our disagreements, our difficulties, our trauma, our trials, our temptations, all of that has to come under the banner of this is how God's people are, because He made us this way. And the way that we're relating to each other is how we're going to create an example. The reason I spent a lot of years as a communitarian, and it happened in a really simple way. I didn't set out, like I wasn't an Acts 2 guy and I just happened to read the Bible. I'm like, okay, let's do community. What happened was I loved people that were really close to me. I had been kind of quasi-alienated my family because I was a weirdo, because I was being really crazy about Christian stuff. And so I didn't have people in my life anymore except for the people that I went to church with. And they were kind of in the same boat. We'd all been quasi-alienated to one degree or another from our families because we were going crazy for obeying Jesus. And so the people that had constituted my family, we all lived in the same little white trash town in Oregon. And my lawnmower broke down. And I was like, oh, I hate mowing my lawn. Now I gotta go buy a lawnmower, do a job that I don't even want to do. And I'm complaining to Uriah's dad. I said, oh, I gotta buy a lawnmower. I hate mowing my lawn. Sorry if you're one of those guys that likes mowing your lawn. I hate it. This is the most vain task to me. I was like, okay, nobody's mowing the forest. Why do I have to mow my lawn? So I'm complaining about this to Shane, and Shane's like, well, I don't have one either. And I was like, oh, well, just so happens we both need a lawnmower, and it just so happens we live about 3 blocks from each other. Why do we need 2 lawnmowers within 3 blocks? That'd be dumb if both of us bought a lawnmower. How often do you use a lawnmower? A couple hours a month? Why don't we both spend half as much money, get twice as nice of a lawnmower, and it can serve us both? Well, if that makes sense with a lawnmower, doesn't it make sense with a wheat grinder or a car or a house? Or how much can you do that way? And that just made sense. And then I read the Bible in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4. I was like, oh, we've been doing this forever. But as I moved around the country looking to try to create more intentional community structures for my life, I ended up realizing that most of the people that were thinking like me were in very remote places for some very practical, expedient reasons. Land is expensive in the city. And so if you want to put a bunch of families together and they've got 100 children between them, it makes way more sense to do that in, I don't know, Kentucky, Minnesota, Montana, Wyoming. So that's where they go. But then I thought, but that's not really the reason I want to do it. Because if there's something to be gained from all that, it's not just about money. I can buy my own lawnmower. That's not the point to me. The point to me is that the world doesn't have to be that way. The world doesn't have to be the way that everyone has to have their own lawnmower. So what value does that have? The value that has in our efficiency, in our camaraderie, in our incorporation into each other's lives is to show the world that there's a better way to do life. Well, if that's the point, then that should be done in the most conspicuous place possible. Because the point in all of it is, how can Jesus model his glory to the earth? And that's why we're here. That's ultimately why we came to this place. Because we wanted to be as visible as we possibly could and be the new humanity, be the new human society, the way that things are supposed to be done. And whenever things are out of whack in the church, whenever things aren't working well, whenever there's conflict and problems or sin or these things that are setting us out of our proper place, most of the grief about that is that it's messing up God's honor. It's messing up the billboard that the church is supposed to be to the world. It's throwing mud on the message that God's making a people on earth that work so much better, that don't have to have policemen to keep people from killing each other, that don't have to war over their possessions, that don't have to try to take from others, that don't have to always put themselves forward and front. A world where each individual thinks more of others than self. And that all of that is about the glory of Christ. That's the priority I want for my life. Okay, it's 4 o'clock. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we want to bless you again for our time today, for our health and for our life and for our minds and our hearts. We want to bless you especially for our place among your people. This incredible opportunity that we get to be a part of the people of God. I pray that you'd receive as much glory and honor as you possibly can wring out of our small lives. I pray, Father, that you'd show us how to be the stone that you want us, the place that you want us to fulfill in your holy temple. I pray that you would help us to smooth off those edges. I pray that you'd help us to yield to the circumstances and the issues in our life that you're using to try to conform us to the image of your dear Son. We recognize, Father, a war for ourselves and our souls, that the world is trying to stamp us into one image and your Spirit is trying to conform us to the image of Christ. And we want to cooperate with you, and we want to reject the world. We ask that you give us grace to do that. Show us the places where we need help. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.